It is late, and the weight of the evening has settled into the floorboards of the room where you are resting. The air itself seems to thicken, moving less as the hours pass, and there is no requirement for you to remain alert. This is the hour for letting the mind drift away from the surface of things, for allowing the body to become heavy and still, and for the sounds of the world to soften into a quiet that exists only for you. There is nothing to solve here, and no need to hold onto the thread of waking thought. If you find that this space is comfortable and you wish to return to it again, you may quietly subscribe to the channel, or simply let this recording be a companion as you rest. There is no requirement to do anything at all. Consider the approach of darkness in a time before electric light. Not the gradual dimming of a room with the flick of a switch, but the slow, absolute swallowing of the world by a night that was truly black. In the medieval centuries, the end of daylight was not a signal for leisure or quiet activity within a well-lit home. It was a threshold. As the sun sank below the horizon, the distinction between the outdoors and the indoors began to dissolve. The cold seeped in through walls of wattle and daub, through the gaps in shutters that were closed not for privacy but for the preservation of warmth. The last light of the hearth fire became the only source of illumination, casting long, unsteady shadows that moved with the breath of those who sat before it. And when that fire was allowed to burn down to embers, to that dull orange glow that barely illuminated the hand held before the face, the world of sight ended. What remained was the world of sound, of touch, of memory, and of a darkness so complete that a person could not see their own hand resting on the blanket beside them. Sleep, in this context, was not a single, unbroken event as it is often understood now. It was a landscape, entered into and departed from multiple times across the long stretch of the night. The idea of a consolidated sleep, 8 hours of unbroken unconsciousness, would have been a strange concept to a farmer in a stone cottage or a merchant in a timber-framed house. Instead, the night was divided into 2 distinct periods of rest. The first sleep, often called the dead sleep, began shortly after the household settled. It was the deep, heavy rest of exhaustion, the sleep that came from bodies worn down by the physical labor of a day that began at first light. This was the sleep of forgetting, a fall into a void where the aches in the back and the soreness in the hands were momentarily absolved. The household lay together, often in a single room, the warmth of bodies the primary source of heat. The air would grow stale, filled with the scent of wool, of smoke trapped in the thatch, of the animals that sometimes sheltered on the ground floor below. The silence of this first sleep was profound, broken only by the breathing of the sleepers, the settling of the building's timbers, and the distant, unknown sounds of the night outside. Then, sometime in the deep hours, a change would occur. One by one, individuals would begin to stir. This was not the fitful waking of insomnia, but a natural, anticipated transition. They would rise from their pallets, moving slowly in the pitch black, their hands finding familiar objects by memory alone. This was the waking period. Could last for an hour or it could last for 2 or 3. The world at this hour was a different place. The fires had long since died to ash, so the cold was at its most intense. Those who rose would wrap themselves in whatever woolen layers they could find, perhaps a cloak or a heavy blanket. There was no hurry. The night was vast, and time was measured not by minutes but by the slow movement of the stars visible through the gaps in the shutters. Some would sit by the cold hearth, their backs against the warm stone that still held a remnant of the day's heat. They would not light a candle, as tallow was too precious and the flame too harsh on eyes accustomed to darkness. They would simply sit in silence and think. This was the hour of contemplation, of quiet conversation, of intimacy. For some, it was a time for prayer, the night office of matins calling the faithful to a state of wakefulness when the rest of the world slept. In a monastery, the bell would sound, and the monks would file into the cold stone church, their voices rising in chant that echoed off the walls, a slow, rhythmic sound that filled the darkness. In a home, a mother might use this time to check on her sleeping children, adjusting a blanket or simply listening to the steady rhythm of their breath. A husband and wife might speak in low voices, their words meant only for each other in the privacy of the sleeping chamber. They might share a piece of bread left from the evening meal, or simply sit together, feeling the shared presence in the darkness. It was a period of quiet industry as well. A woman might spin wool by touch, the distaff held steady, the thread pulled and twisted with practiced fingers that required no light. A craftsman might think through the work of the coming day, the solution to a problem presenting itself in the stillness of the pre-dawn mind. It was a time for conception, both of children and of ideas, born in the quiet hours when the demands of the day were suspended. This waking period was not feared. It was accepted as a natural part of the night's architecture. The body, after its first deep rest, was ready for a period of quiet consciousness before the second sleep would take it. There was no concept of sleep maintenance insomnia, no anxiety attached to the act of being awake when the world was dark. Instead, it was simply the structure of life. After this interval, the body would begin to feel the pull of rest again. The cold would become more penetrating, and the desire for the warmth of the bed would grow. They would return to their sleeping places, perhaps adding a log to the embers to take the edge off the chill, and settle in for the second sleep. This was the sleep of the late night, the sleep that carried them through until the first hints of gray light began to seep through the shutters. It was often a lighter sleep, filled with dreams that lingered on the edge of waking, a slow ascent back towards the world of the living. The bed itself, when it existed, was not the private, separate structure it is today. It was a piece of communal furniture. In the homes of the wealthy, the great bed was a statement of status, a massive wooden frame with heavy curtains that could be drawn shut to create a small, enclosed chamber within a chamber. These curtains served to trap heat, to block drafts, and to provide a measure of privacy in a hall where servants and retainers often slept on pallets on the floor. The bed was a place of business, of birth, of death, and of sleep. It was not uncommon for travelers to share a bed with strangers in an inn, a practice accepted as a simple necessity of the road. There was no sense of personal space in sleep as there is now. To sleep was to surrender the boundaries of the self to the proximity of others. The sounds of another's breathing, the warmth of a body beside you, the shift of weight on the straw mattress, these were the constant companions of the sleeping mind. Children slept with parents, apprentices slept with masters, and guests slept with hosts, all folded into the same space, breathing the same stale air, rising and falling with the same slow rhythm of the household. The physical experience of sleeping was one of surfaces and textures. The mattress, if one was fortunate, was a sack filled with straw, which would be changed seasonally. Over time, the straw would break down, becoming dusty and flat, and the mattress would require restuffing. The sound of it was a constant, dry rustle with every movement. Above the straw might be a layer of wool or feathers for those who could afford such comfort, but for most, the straw itself was the primary cushion against the wooden slats or rope lattice of the bed frame. The ropes, which gave the phrase "sleep tight" its origin, would stretch with use and needed to be tightened regularly to maintain a firm, supportive surface. Above the mattress were sheets of linen, a fabric that was labor-intensive to produce and therefore highly valued. Linen felt cool against the skin, a sharp contrast to the heavy wool blankets that were piled on top. The weight of these blankets was considerable, a pressure that held the sleeper in place. They were woven in dark, natural colors from the wool of sheep, retaining the faint, musky scent of the animal and the lanolin that had not been fully washed away. In the coldest months, the sleeper might pull a fur over the wool, the hair side turned inward for warmth, the smell of cured hide filling the small space beneath the blankets. To prepare for sleep was to engage in a ritual of closure. The hearth fire, which had been the center of the home's life throughout the day, was banked. This meant covering the hot embers with ash to slow their burning, preserving the heat and a core of live coal that could be revived in the morning. The act of banking the fire was a final task, a signal that the day's work was done. The door would be barred from the inside, a heavy beam of wood dropped into iron brackets, sealing the household against the night and the unknown. Shutters were closed, blocking out the cold and the moonlight, plunging the interior into that absolute darkness. The animals, if they were kept inside, would be checked. A hand run over the flank of a cow, the latch of a chicken coop ensured. These final movements were slow, deliberate, performed by the last person awake, often the master or mistress of the house, who would move through the space by memory and feel, their feet familiar with every uneven stone in the floor. Then, they too would find their place among the sleepers, pulling the heavy blankets up to their chin, and surrender to the quiet. The sounds of the sleeping household were a complex tapestry. Beneath the primary layer of breathing, the deep, slow inhales and exhales of the first sleep, there were other, smaller sounds. The soft murmur of a dream from a child, the grind of teeth, the rustle of straw as someone shifted, seeking a cooler spot beneath the blankets. The occasional cough, stifled into a woolen sleeve. And over all of this, the house itself contributed its own voice. The timbers of the roof, dried by the day's heat, would contract in the cold night air, producing sudden, sharp cracks that sounded like footsteps on the floor above. The wind, if it was blowing, would find the gaps around the shutters and the door, creating a low, persistent whistle or a deeper moan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. A mouse might run along the base of the wall, its tiny claws making a skittering sound on the packed earth floor. A dog, curled at the foot of the bed, might twitch and whine in its sleep. It was not a quiet environment, but it was a familiar one, a soundscape that was as much a part of sleep as the darkness itself. Beyond the walls of the home, the night held its own rhythms. In a village, there was no artificial light to pollute the sky, so the stars were a constant, overwhelming presence on a clear night. The Milky Way was a river of light, bright enough to cast faint shadows. But even that light was lost to those inside with the shutters closed. The sounds of the village at night were sparse but distinct. The barking of a dog in a distant farmstead, the cry of a fox in the woods beyond the fields, the occasional bellow of a cow disturbed by something unseen. In a walled town, the soundscape was different. There might be the footfall of a night watchman on the cobblestones, his slow, measured pace a reassurance to those who lay awake listening. He might call out the hour, or simply announce that all was well, his voice a low, resonant sound that traveled through the narrow streets. There was the distant clang of a bell from a church tower, marking the hours of the night offices. These sounds were not intrusions. They were the fabric of the night, the proof that the world continued to exist beyond the closed door, that there were others awake and watchful in the darkness. The transition from the first sleep to the waking period was often marked by a change in these external sounds. The deep stillness of midnight would give way to a subtle shift. Perhaps the wind would die down, leaving a more profound silence. Perhaps the first distant crow of a rooster, a sound that was not the morning alarm but a random, disoriented call from a bird sensing a change in the atmosphere. Within the room, the breathing of the sleepers would become lighter, more restless. A child would cry out briefly, then fall silent. The embers in the hearth, which had been a dull, almost invisible presence, might flare up for a moment as a pocket of air shifted, casting a brief, red glow across the room before subsiding again. This was the cue for waking, a slow emergence from the depths of rest that was as natural as the rising of sap in a tree. There was no jarring alarm. The body simply knew, after a certain number of hours, that the first sleep was complete and it was time to surface. During this waking interval, the world was experienced entirely through senses other than sight. To move through the home was to rely on a mental map built over years of living in the same space. The hand would find the doorframe, the edge of the table, the stool by the hearth. The sense of touch was heightened. The cold of the stone floor through the soles of bare feet. The rough texture of a wool blanket wrapped around the shoulders. The smooth, worn wood of a chair arm. The sense of smell was also acute. The lingering smoke from the hearth, now cold and acrid. The scent of the night air seeping in through the cracks, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, of distant fields, of the forest. The faint, sweet smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, lavender, rosemary, mint, intended to ward off illness and freshen the air. And beneath all of this, the constant, pervasive scent of humanity, of bodies that had not been washed in the way modern bodies are washed, a smell of skin and hair and wool and straw, all intermingled into a single familiar odor that was the scent of home. This period of wakefulness was a liminal space, a time between sleeps. It was not day, but it was not the deep night either. It was a pause, a parenthesis in the rhythm of rest. Some would use this time for quiet contemplation of dreams. The dreams of the first sleep were often considered the more significant, the ones sent by God or by the spirits of the natural world. To lie in the darkness and turn a dream over in the mind, to examine its symbols and its feelings, was a common practice. Others would use the time for more practical matters. A woman might rise to check on a batch of bread that had been left to rise by the dying heat of the hearth, her hands plunging into the cool dough, feeling its texture, deciding whether it was ready to be shaped for the morning's baking. A man might go to the door, unbar it briefly, and step outside to read the weather. He would stand in the cold air, looking up at the sky, noting the position of the stars, the direction of the wind, the presence or absence of clouds. He would listen to the sounds of the night, discerning from them what the new day might bring. Then he would close the door, replace the bar, and return to the warmth of the bed, bringing with him a small piece of the outside world that he would carry into his second sleep. The second sleep, once entered, was a different quality of rest. It was lighter, closer to the surface. The dreams of this period were often more fragmented, more tied to the immediate sensations of the body. The cold that had become more intense during the waking period would begin to recede as the body heat of the sleepers warmed the space beneath the blankets again. The breathing of the household would settle into a new, shallower rhythm. This was the sleep that was most easily disturbed. The first light of dawn, even before the sun crested the horizon, would begin to change the quality of the darkness behind the shutters. The absolute black would give way to a deep gray, then to a softer, more translucent darkness. The birds would begin their pre-dawn chorus, a tentative chirping that would grow into a full-throated cacophony as the light increased. A neighbor's rooster would crow with certainty this time, its call answered by another in the distance. The household would begin to stir, not in the quiet, deliberate way of the midnight waking, but in a gradual, collective movement towards the new day. The second sleep would thin, becoming a state of half-consciousness, of drifting between the world of dreams and the world of the room. And then, with the sound of someone rising, of a log being placed on the embers, of a shutter being opened to let in the pale, cold light of morning, the night would be over. The concept of privacy in sleep was nearly absent. Even in the castles of the nobility, the bedchamber was not the private retreat it would later become. It was a space where the lord and lady might receive visitors, where servants slept on pallets or on the floor at the foot of the great bed, where children and attendants shared the same room. The act of undressing was not a private ritual. Clothing was layered and complex, and often required assistance to remove. A person would be unlaced, unbuttoned, and helped into a sleeping garment, all in the presence of others. To be seen in a state of undress was not the cause of embarrassment it is now. It was simply a practical aspect of daily life. The body was a familiar object, its functions and its needs a matter of common knowledge. The sounds of the body during sleep, the snoring, the passing of wind, the sighs and moans, were simply the sounds of a living being at rest, unremarkable and unremarked upon. For those who had no bed at all, sleep was an even more elemental experience. The poorest members of society, the wandering laborers, the beggars, the pilgrims on the road, would sleep where they could. In the corner of a barn, the straw of the floor providing some insulation from the cold ground. In the lee of a stone wall, wrapped in a single thin cloak, the body curled into a tight ball to conserve heat. In the porch of a church, the stone steps offering a hard, cold surface, but the building itself providing a slight shelter from the wind. This was a sleep of exposure, of vulnerability. The distinction between sleeping and waking was less distinct when the body was constantly aware of its surroundings, of the hardness of the ground, of the cold that penetrated through every layer of clothing, of the need to remain alert to the presence of other travelers or of animals. This was sleep stripped of all comfort, reduced to its most basic function, the temporary cessation of consciousness required for the body to continue functioning. It was a sleep from which one rose not rested, but simply less exhausted than before. The morning after such a night would begin not with the luxury of lingering in bed, but with the immediate resumption of labor. The hearth would be uncovered, the embers raked and coaxed back into flame with dry kindling and a breath. The household would gather around it, rubbing sleep from their eyes, warming hands that had grown stiff in the night. The pottage that had been left to simmer by the dying heat would be reheated. A simple meal of grains and perhaps a few vegetables, eaten from wooden bowls with fingers or with a spoon carved from a single piece of wood. The bread, if it had been baked during the night's waking interval, would be broken and shared. There was no silence in the morning. The sounds of the day would begin, the grinding of grain, the clatter of a pail being filled at the well, the voices of neighbors calling to one another as they began their work. The world of the night, with its deep sleeps and its quiet intervals, would recede into memory, becoming a private experience that each individual carried with them but did not speak of. The night was for rest and for the interior life. The day was for action and for the community. As the day progressed, the memory of the night's sleep would begin to shape the experience of the day itself. The body carried the weight of its rest or its lack of it. A farmer who had experienced a restless first sleep, troubled by dreams or by the cold, would feel that fatigue in his muscles as he guided the plow. A mother who had spent much of her waking interval tending to a sick child would move more slowly through her tasks, her thoughts still partly in the darkness of the night just past. The anticipation of the coming night was always present, a distant pull that grew stronger as the sun began its descent. The day's work was structured by the knowledge that darkness would fall, that the light would end, and that all must be in order before that happened. The last meal of the day, the supper, was eaten by the light of the fire or by a single tallow candle, a meal that was often simpler than the midday dinner. It was a time for winding down, for the telling of stories, for the mending of tools by the firelight, for the quieting of the mind in preparation for the night that was to come. And so the cycle would repeat. The banking of the fire, the closing of the shutters, the barring of the door, the settling of bodies onto straw mattresses and wool blankets, the descent into the first sleep, the quiet, contemplative waking in the deep hours, the second, lighter sleep, the gradual approach of dawn. It was a rhythm that was not chosen but was simply the structure of existence, imposed by the limitations of light and fuel and the fundamental needs of the human body. There was no sense of fighting against this rhythm, no attempt to conquer the night with artificial light or to impose a different schedule upon the body. The night was a partner in the dance of days, a time that was given its own space and its own purpose, distinct from the world of work and light. To sleep in the medieval world was to participate in a vast, ancient pattern, one that connected the individual to the household to the village, and the village to the slow, inexorable turning of the earth away from the sun and back towards it again. In the quiet of the room where you now rest, the darkness is perhaps not as absolute as it once was. There may be the glow of a device, or the faint light of a street lamp seeping through the window. The sounds are different, the hum of a machine, the distant passing of a car. But the body's need for the architecture of the night remains. The two sleeps, the waking interval, the weight of blankets, the presence of another breathing in the darkness. These are not ancient practices left behind in a medieval past. They are patterns written into the body's own understanding of rest, patterns that can be felt in the quiet hours when the mind lets go of the demands of the day. To lie in the stillness and feel the pull of the first sleep, to surface in the deep hours and simply be present in the darkness, to settle again into the lighter sleep of the late night. This is to participate in a rhythm that is older than any technology, older than any house or any city. It is the rhythm of the body remembering its own nature, finding its way back to a pattern of rest that is not about efficiency or productivity, but about the simple, slow turning of the mind away from the world and back towards itself, again and again, through the long, quiet passage of the night. The warmth of the blankets holds you in place, and the darkness of the room is complete. The sounds of the house, whatever they may be, have become a familiar background, a texture against which the silence is defined. There is no requirement to remain awake, and no requirement to fall asleep. There is only the present moment, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The night is long, and it has its own structure, its own intervals of depth and shallowness, its own quiet periods of wakefulness that are not disruptions but simply part of the pattern. The body knows this pattern. It has always known it. In the stillness, you can feel the pull of that first deep rest, the invitation to let go of the surface of the mind and drift down into the quiet interior. And later, in the deepest part of the night, there may be a time of waking, a time of stillness and thought, a time to simply be present in the darkness before the second sleep takes you. And all of this is as it should be. There is no end to the night, only the slow, steady turning towards the dawn, and the long, quiet hours in between, where rest is not a problem to be solved but a state to be entered, again and again, as the world outside grows still and the mind within finds its own deep and ancient rhythm. The fire, if there is one, has long since settled into a bed of ash, and the only light comes from the memory of warmth. In the sleeping places of that older world, the body was not arranged in the straight, supine posture that is often pictured. There was no rule for how one should lie, and the positions were as varied as the individuals who occupied the straw. Some slept curled on their sides, knees drawn up toward the chest, a posture that conserved heat and mimicked the shape of the body before birth. Others slept on their stomachs, faces turned to one side, an arm tucked beneath the pillow of wool or folded cloth. To sleep on the back was less common, as this position left the throat and chest exposed to the cold drafts that moved through the room, and it was a posture associated with the dead laid out for burial. The living preferred to fold themselves inward, to make themselves small against the vastness of the night. And throughout the hours of rest, they would turn and shift, moving from one position to another, following the demands of a cooling blanket or a pressure against a hip bone. The bed was not a static stage. It was a landscape of small, continuous adjustments. Consider the pillow if it existed. For most, the pillow was not the soft, lofted object of later centuries. It was a bolster, a long, firm cylinder of stuffed linen that ran the width of the bed, or it was simply a folded piece of clothing placed beneath the head. The wealthy might have pillows filled with down or feathers, but these were rare and carefully guarded. The more common filling was straw or dried rushes, or even the wool of a sheep that had been washed but not carded, which had a tendency to clump into hard, uncomfortable lumps. The sound of a head settling onto such a pillow was a dry, rustling sound, like wind moving through a field of harvested grain. The pillow held the shape of the head after it was lifted, a small depression that would slowly fill back in as the straw resettled. And the scent of the pillow was the scent of the field from which it came, mixed with the scent of the sweat and hair of the sleeper, a combination that grew stronger and more complex with each passing night. The blankets, too, had their own behaviors. They did not stay neatly tucked. The sleeper would pull and kick, twist and gather, so that by the middle of the first sleep, the blankets were often a tangled nest rather than a flat covering. A foot would escape and grow cold, and the sleeper would shift to reclaim it, pulling the wool back over the exposed skin with a motion that was unconscious, performed in the borderland between sleeping and waking. Children, in particular, were notorious for disarranging the bedding, and a mother might reach out in the darkness to pull a blanket back over a small, chilled shoulder, her hand finding the familiar shape of her child by touch alone. The blankets were also shared. To pull too much of the covering toward oneself was to leave another sleeper exposed, and this negotiation happened constantly, silently, throughout the night. Two bodies in the same bed would develop a rhythm of shared warmth, a cooperation of sleep that required no conscious thought but was as precise as any dance. In the homes of the very poor, there might be no bed frame at all. The sleeper would lie directly on the floor, on a pile of straw that was raked into a corner each morning and spread out again each night. This straw was often mixed with dried bracken or heather, plants that had a sharp, green scent even when dry. The floor beneath was packed earth, or perhaps stone if the dwelling was built on a rocky foundation. The cold rising from the ground was a constant presence, seeping up through the straw, through the single blanket, into the bones of the sleeper. To lie on the floor was to be aware of the earth itself, of its dampness and its hardness, of the way it held the chill of the night long after the sun had gone. There was no barrier between the body and the ground except the thin, inadequate layer of plant matter and wool. And yet the body would sleep. Exhaustion would overcome discomfort, and the sleeper would descend into the same first sleep, the same waking interval, the same second sleep, as the Lord in his curtained bed. The architecture of the night did not require comfort. It only required darkness and time, and the slow, patient surrender of the conscious mind. The room itself in those hours became a different place. The objects of daily life, the table, the stools, the chest against the wall, lost their daytime identities and became shapes in the darkness, obstacles to be navigated by memory and touch. A cloak hanging from a peg became, in the half-light of a waking moment, the silhouette of a person standing in the corner. The shifting of a curtain could look like a hand reaching out. The mind, freed from the input of the eyes, would sometimes populate the darkness with images drawn from memory or from dream, superimposing faces and forms onto the familiar shapes of the room. This was not frightening, necessarily. It was simply the way the mind worked when the world of sight was taken away. To wake in the deep night and see, for a moment, a figure standing at the foot of the bed, only to blink and realize it was a pile of folded blankets. This was a common experience, so common as to be unremarkable. The figure would dissolve, the mind would settle, and the sleeper would turn toward the warmth of the body beside them and close their eyes again. The sensation of time during the night was also different. Without a clock, without even the regular striking of a bell for those who did not live within earshot of a church, time was measured in the body's own rhythms and in the progress of the stars. A sleeper who woke in the interval between the first and second sleeps would have no way of knowing whether they had been resting for 2 hours or for 4. They would simply know that they had completed the first sleep and that the second sleep lay ahead. The length of the waking interval was determined not by a schedule but by a feeling. When the body had rested enough from the first sleep, when the mind had wandered through its thoughts and its prayers, when the cold had begun to penetrate too deeply, then it was time to return to the blankets and seek the second sleep. There was no urgency. There was no need to calculate how many hours remained before dawn. The dawn would come when it came, and the body would know, by the quality of the light behind the shutters and by the change in the sounds of the birds, when it was time to rise. In the great halls of a castle, the sleeping arrangements were more complex but followed the same essential pattern. The lord and lady might retire to a solar, a small, private chamber above the great hall, where a bed with curtains and a feather mattress awaited them. But even here, the room was not empty. A trusted servant might sleep on a pallet at the foot of the bed, ready to attend to any need in the night. A child might be brought in if they were ill or frightened. The curtains around the bed would be drawn, creating a small, enclosed world within the larger room, a world of warmth and darkness and the sound of 2 people breathing in close proximity. And in the great hall below, the retainers and servants and travelers would spread their pallets on the floor, each person claiming a small territory of straw and blanket, the fire in the central hearth casting a dim, flickering glow over the sleeping bodies. The hall would be a field of recumbent forms, some curled, some sprawled, some covered entirely by their cloaks, others with arms flung out, fingers brushing against the straw of a neighbor's pallet. And through this field, in the deep hours, someone would move. A mother checking on a child, a servant adding a log to the fire, a man rising to step outside into the cold air. They would walk carefully, stepping over and between the sleeping bodies, their feet silent on the rushes that covered the stone floor. And no one would wake, or if they did, they would simply turn over and sink back into the first sleep, or rise themselves and join the quiet procession of the night. The relationship between sleep and dreaming was also understood differently. Dreams were not merely the random firing of a resting brain. They were visitations. They were messages from God or from the saints or from the dead. They were warnings or prophecies or glimpses into a reality that existed alongside the waking world. A dream that came in the first sleep was considered the most powerful, the most likely to be true. A dream that came in the second sleep was more fleeting, more tied to the body's own sensations. A dream of thirst or of cold or of the pressure of a blanket against the face. The waking interval, that quiet period between sleeps, was the time for interpreting these dreams, for turning them over in the mind, for deciding what they might mean and what action, if any, they required. A man who dreamed of a black dog might wake in the deep night and lie still, his heart beating slowly, considering whether the dog was a warning of illness or of betrayal. A woman who dreamed of a flowering tree might understand it as a promise of pregnancy or of a harvest to come. The dreams were woven into the fabric of the night, as real and as significant as the cold air on the face or the sound of the wind in the eaves. And then, as the night aged, the second sleep would begin to thin. The light behind the shutters would shift from black to gray, and the gray would slowly lighten, becoming a soft, diffuse illumination that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The birds would begin their song, a single tentative note that would be answered by another, and then another, until the air was filled with a chorus that was both chaotic and harmonious. The roosters would crow, their calls sharp and insistent, pulling the household toward wakefulness. The fire, if it had been banked properly, would still hold a core of heat, and the first person to rise would rake back the ash and uncover the red, pulsing embers, blowing on them gently until a flame caught and grew. The flame would illuminate the room, revealing the shapes that had been hidden in the darkness. the faces of the sleepers, the texture of the walls, the familiar objects of daily life. One by one, the others would stir, sitting up, rubbing their eyes, pulling blankets around their shoulders against the morning chill. The night was over. The cycle of sleep had completed itself, and the cycle of the day was beginning again, as it had begun every morning for as long as there had been people to wake and fires to light. And somewhere in the depths of the room, in the warm hollow of the bed, the shape of the night remained, waiting for the sun to set again, waiting for the shutters to close, waiting for the darkness to return and the sleepers to lie down once more and begin the long, slow descent into the first sleep, and the waking, and the second sleep, and all the quiet, hidden hours that made up the architecture of the medieval night. The straw in the mattress, after many nights, begins to lose its resilience. It compresses into a dense mat, no longer springing back when the sleeper rises. The indentations of bodies become permanent maps of the night, shallow depressions where hips and shoulders have pressed down through the linen, through the wool, into the packed stems below. There is no replacement of the straw except at long intervals, perhaps when the seasons change and fresh straw becomes available from the threshing floor. Until then, the sleeper lies in the hollow they have made for themselves, a bed shaped by the slow accumulation of their own weight. To lie in such a hollow is to be held, in a way. The edges of the depression rise up on either side, a low wall of compressed straw that contains the body and keeps the blankets from slipping entirely away. It is a place formed by the sleeper for the sleeper, a cup of warmth in the larger cold of the room. The children, when there are children, do not always remain in their own hollows. In the deep hours, a small body will migrate, moving without waking, drawn by the warmth of the larger bodies nearby. A mother will wake to find a child pressed against her back, or curled into the space between her arm and her side, the small face buried in the folds of her sleeping shift. A father will shift to make room, his arm extending to encircle the child who has inserted itself between them. The bed accommodates these movements without complaint. It stretches its warmth to cover the new configuration, the blankets rearranging themselves in the slow, unconscious adjustments of the sleepers. By morning, the arrangement of bodies may bear no resemblance to the arrangement at nightfall. What began with 2 in the bed may end with 4 or 5, the children having drifted in from their own pallets like leaves collecting in a sheltered corner. And no one remembers the migration. It is simply the way of the night. In the monasteries, the architecture of sleep was ordered by rule. The monk did not sleep alone, nor did he sleep in the warmth of a family bed. He slept in a dormitory, a long, high-ceilinged room where rows of narrow beds were arranged along the walls, each separated by a low partition or a thin curtain. The beds were narrow, barely wider than the body that occupied them, and the mattress was of straw, the blanket of coarse wool. The monk lay on his back or on his side with his face turned toward the wall, and he slept in his clothing, the same habit he wore during the day, so that when the bell rang for the night office, he could rise immediately and make his way to the church without the need for dressing. There was no privacy, no warmth from other bodies except in the sense of shared space, the collective heat of many sleepers raising the temperature of the room by a few degrees. And yet the rhythm was the same. The first sleep, from Compline to Matins. The waking, when the bell would pull them from their beds and they would file into the cold church, their voices rising in the chant of the psalms, the words worn smooth by repetition. Then the return to the dormitory, the second sleep until lauds, until prime, until the sun rose and the day's work began. The monk's night was broken by obligation, but it was not broken in the sense of disruption. It was structured, purposeful, each segment of sleep framed by prayer and by the collective voice of the community moving through the darkness together. For those who lived alone, the night was a different matter. The hermit in his cell, the widow in her cottage, the shepherd in his bothy on the hillside, These slept without the reassurance of other bodies, without the shared warmth of a household. Their sleep was more alert, more conscious of the sounds outside the door, more attuned to the movement of the wind and the calls of the night animals. A hermit might wake in the interval between sleeps and lie in the darkness, listening to the silence that surrounded his small dwelling, a silence that was not empty but filled with the presence of God, or with the presence of his own thoughts, which in the solitude of the night could seem as loud as voices. He would say his prayers, the words familiar, the rhythm of them a comfort against the vastness of the night. And then he would turn on his straw pallet, pull his single blanket tighter, and seek the second sleep, knowing that when he woke again, it would be to the gray light of dawn and the beginning of another day of silence and labor. His sleep was no less deep for being solitary, but it was different. It was a sleep that listened. The animals in the homes where they were kept had their own sleep rhythms, and these rhythms interwove with the rhythms of the human sleepers. A cow, lying in the byre that was often attached to the house or even within the same room, would chew her cud through the night, the slow, rhythmic motion of her jaw a constant, low sound that became as familiar as breathing. A horse in the stable would stamp a hoof, or snort, or shift its weight, the sounds carrying through the walls. A dog would dream, its legs twitching, a muffled whine escaping from its throat as it chased some invisible quarry through the fields of sleep. A cat would move through the house, silent, its eyes reflecting the faintest light, its body a shadow among shadows. These sounds were not interruptions. They were the texture of the night, the proof that the world of the living continued even when the humans had withdrawn from it. To lie in the darkness and hear the cow chewing, the dog dreaming, the cat moving. This was to know oneself to be part of a household that extended beyond the human, a community of sleeping and waking creatures that shared the same darkness and the same slow passage toward dawn. The changing of the seasons imposed their own structure on the night. In the winter, the nights were long, stretching from the early darkness of late afternoon to the late dawn of the morning. The first sleep would begin when the last light had faded, and the waking interval would come in the deepest part of the night, when the cold was most intense. The second sleep would then extend into the morning, the sleepers lingering in the warmth of the bed long after the first gray light had appeared, waiting for the sun to rise and bring some measure of heat to the world. In the summer, the nights were short, barely more than a few hours of darkness between the long evenings and the early dawns. The first sleep would be compressed, the waking interval shortened or sometimes omitted entirely, the second sleep blending into the first. The body adjusted to these changes without conscious effort, responding to the light and the temperature and the length of the darkness as naturally as it responded to hunger or thirst. The rhythm of sleep was not a fixed schedule but a flexible response to the world, bending and shifting with the turning of the year. And in the spaces between the sleeping places, in the rooms and the halls and the cottages of that older world, there was always the possibility of the unexpected. A traveler might arrive late, his knock at the door pulling a household from the first sleep. He would be admitted, given a place by the fire, offered a bowl of pottage and a place on the floor with a blanket, and the household would settle again, the rhythm of the night accommodating the new presence. A woman might go into labor in the deep hours, her cries pulling the other women from their beds. The fire built up, water heated, the household transformed from a place of sleep to a place of urgent, focused activity. A child might fall ill, its fever rising in the night, and a mother would sit by the pallet, her hand on the small forehead, watching the face of her child by the light of a single candle, waiting for the fever to break. These events were not anomalies. They were woven into the fabric of the night, as much a part of its structure as the first sleep and the second. The night was not a sealed container, separate from the life of the day. It was continuous with that life, a time when the ordinary events of birth and death and arrival and departure could occur, framed by the darkness and the quiet and the slow, patient presence of those who waited. The light of a single candle, when it was used, changed the nature of the night. It was not the bright, steady light of a modern lamp. It was a small, wavering flame that cast more shadow than illumination, that made the room seem larger and stranger than it was in the full light of day. The flame would gutter in a draught, and the shadows on the walls would leap and shift, the shapes of furniture and bodies distorting into forms that were almost alive. The candle was used sparingly, for tallow was precious and beeswax even more so, and the making of a candle required labor, the rendering of fat, the dipping or pouring of the wick, the careful storage of the finished product. To light a candle in the night was to make a decision, to mark the hour as significant in some way. A woman spinning in the waking interval might work by the light of the dying fire alone, her fingers finding the thread without the need for sight. But a mother watching over a sick child would keep a candle burning, its small flame a focus for her attention, its light enough to see the child's face, to count the breaths, to mark the slow passage of the hours until dawn. And when the candle burned down, sputtering in a pool of melted tallow, she would extinguish it with her fingers, and the room would return to darkness, and she would continue her watch by touch and by sound alone. The sound of rain on the roof was a constant companion for many nights. It was not a sound that woke the sleeper, but a sound that wrapped around the sleep, a soft, continuous percussion that filled the darkness with a kind of presence. On a night of heavy rain, the roof of thatch or shingle would become a membrane through which the water moved, and the sound would be a low, rushing roar, punctuated by the drip of water finding its way through a weak spot in the covering. A sleeper would register this drip without waking, or would wake just enough to shift the blanket away from the damp spot on the floor, then sink back into the first sleep. The rain would continue through the waking interval, its sound a steady backdrop to the quiet thoughts and the murmured prayers. And in the second sleep, the rain might begin to lessen, the roar fading to a patter, the patter fading to a drip, the drip ceasing altogether as the clouds moved on and the sky cleared, revealing the stars that had been hidden. The sleeper would not notice the change. The rain would have become so much a part of the night that its absence was as unnoticed as its presence. But in the morning, when the shutters were opened, the world would be changed. The ground wet, the air fresh, the scent of damp earth filling the room, and the night, with its rain and its sleeps, would be a memory, a piece of time that had passed and would not return, replaced by the light and the work of the new day. In the quiet of the present room, where the listener lies in the darkness, the echoes of those older nights remain. The body still knows the rhythm of the first sleep and the second, even if the waking interval has been forgotten or suppressed. The mind still knows the quality of the deep night, the time when thoughts surface and drift, when dreams press against the edges of consciousness. The need for warmth, for the presence of another, for the familiar sounds of a household breathing and shifting in the darkness. These needs have not been erased by electric light or by the modern insistence on a single, consolidated sleep. They are older than any of those things, older than the houses we build and the beds we make. They are the architecture of rest that the body carries within itself, waiting for the night to fall and the darkness to close around it, waiting to enter the long, slow descent into the first sleep, the quiet waking, the second sleep, and all the small, hidden hours that lie between. The night is not an empty space to be filled with wakefulness or with anxiety. It is a landscape, familiar and ancient, and the body knows how to move through it, knows the paths, knows the rhythms, knows the way from the closing of the shutters to the first gray light of dawn. There is nothing to do but lie still, and let the darkness take the weight, and wait for the first sleep to come, as it has come for every sleeper in every darkness, for as long as there have been nights and bodies to rest within them. The house settles around you, the timbers cooling, the walls holding the darkness close. The straw in the mattress, if there is straw, holds the shape of your body, a hollow made for you alone. And the night continues, as it always has, patient, inexhaustible, waiting for the sleeper to find their way into its depths and rest. The hour deepens, and the distinction between the room and the world outside becomes less distinct. The walls, which during the day define a clear boundary between interior and exterior, begin to feel thinner as the night progresses. The cold that presses against the outside of the house seeks the warmth within, finding its way through the gaps around the door, through the imperfect seal of the shutters, through the very fabric of the walls themselves. There is a point in the deepest part of the night when the temperature inside and the temperature outside are nearly the same, when the fire has long since died to ash and the only warmth comes from the bodies of the sleepers, clustered together in the bed. The breath of each sleeper becomes visible in the darkness, a small cloud of moisture that rises and dissipates before it can reach the ceiling. The air is still, heavy with the scent of wool and skin and the faint, sharp smell of cold that comes from the stones of the floor. To wake in this hour is to be aware of the cold as a physical presence, something that touches the face and the hands with fingers that are patient and without haste. In the cottages of the very poor, the cold was a constant companion, not only in the deep night but throughout the hours of rest. The walls, if they were of wattle and daub, would have cracks that let in the wind, and the roof of thatch, though thick, would allow the cold air to settle down into the single room below. The sleeper would pull their single blanket up over their head, creating a small tent of warmth, the air inside growing moist and warm with each exhaled breath. To sleep in this way was to sleep within a cocoon, the blanket a membrane between the warmth of the body and the cold of the room. The face would be covered, the mouth and nose finding a small opening through which to breathe, a gap that would be adjusted throughout the night as the sleeper turned and shifted. In the morning, the blanket would be damp with the moisture of many hours of breath, and it would be hung near the rekindled fire to dry before the next night came. This covering of the head, this retreat into a small, enclosed space of warmth, was not a sign of poverty alone. Even in the great houses, sleepers would pull the bed curtains closed and draw the blankets up, creating a similar enclosure, a world within a world where the cold could not reach and the darkness was complete. The act of undressing for sleep, in those households where garments were changed, was a slow and deliberate process. The clothing of the day was layered, a linen shift or shirt next to the skin, then woolen hose and a tunic or gown, then perhaps a surcoat or a mantle for warmth. Each layer had its own fastenings, laces, ties, brooches, buttons, each of which required fingers that were stiff with cold to undo. In the darkness, this undressing was done by touch, the hands moving over the body with a familiarity that required no sight. The garments would be folded and placed in a chest or on a stool at the foot of the bed, ready for the morning. And then the sleeper would pull the night garment over their head, a simple shift or shirt, often the same garment that had been worn beneath the day's clothing, for there was no concept of a separate sleeping costume for most people. They would climb into the bed, the straw rustling, the blankets pulled up, and the warmth of their own body would begin to heat the small space beneath the covers. The cold linen of the sheet would feel sharp against the skin for a moment, and then it would begin to warm, and the body would relax, the muscles releasing the tension of the day, the mind beginning its slow drift toward the first sleep. There were those who did not undress at all. The traveler who slept in a barn or a field, the soldier on campaign, the pilgrim on the road. These would sleep in the same clothing they had worn through the day, adding perhaps a cloak or an extra layer if they had one. Their sleep was not a retreat into softness but a continuation of the day's endurance, a pause in the journey that was not marked by any change of state. They would find a place against a wall or beneath a tree, wrap themselves as best they could, and close their eyes, their bodies sinking into a sleep that was not deep but was sufficient, a sleep that could be broken at any moment by a sound or a change in the weather. And when they woke, they would be exactly as they had been when they closed their eyes, clothed, ready, the journey continuing without the need for the rituals of dressing and undressing that marked the sleep of those who had a fixed place to rest. The position of the bed within the room was never arbitrary. In a medieval house, the bed was placed with consideration for the hearth, for the door, for the windows, for the path of the sun across the floor. The head of the bed was often placed against the warmest wall, the wall that absorbed the heat of the fire during the day and released it slowly through the night. The foot of the bed faced the hearth so that the heat, when there was heat, would reach the sleepers directly. In some houses, the bed was built into the wall, a box bed with doors that could be closed, creating a small, enclosed chamber that retained the heat of the sleepers and kept out the drafts. These box beds were often built into the wall that backed onto the hearth, so that the stone would hold the warmth of the fire and radiate it into the sleeping space throughout the night. To sleep in such a bed was to sleep in a cave of warmth. The doors closed, the darkness absolute, the sounds of the room muffled by the wood. The sleeper would lie within this small space, surrounded on three sides by wood or stone, the only opening the door through which they had entered, and they would sleep as deeply as if they had been buried in the earth itself, waiting for the morning to come and open the door and let in the light. The rhythm of the night in a castle was marked by the changing of the watch. On the walls, men would walk their assigned rounds, their footsteps a regular sound that carried across the courtyard and through the windows of the chambers. They would call out the hour, or exchange words with the man they were relieving, their voices low but audible in the stillness. Within the great hall, the sleepers would register these sounds without waking, the voices of the watch becoming part of the fabric of the night, as familiar as the crackling of the fire or the breathing of the dogs. A sleeper who did wake might lie and listen, counting the calls, determining by the number of calls how much of the night had passed. The watch would continue through the hours, the men moving along the walls, their torches flickering in the wind, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the walls for any sign of movement. And below them, in the hall and the chambers, the sleepers would turn and dream, the first sleep giving way to the waking interval, the waking interval giving way to the second, the rhythm of the night proceeding as it had for all the nights before. In the villages, the night was marked by the church bell. The bell would ring for Compline, the office that closed the day, and the villagers would hear it as they banked their fires and closed their shutters. It would ring again in the deep night for matins, the office that called the faithful to prayer in the hours before dawn, and those who were awake in the interval between sleeps would hear it and perhaps say a prayer in response. It would ring for lauds, the office of dawn, and the sleepers would stir in their beds, knowing that the night was ending and the day was about to begin. The bell was not an intrusion. It was the voice of the community, marking the passage of time through the darkness, reminding the sleepers that they were not alone, that there were others awake and praying in the church, that the rhythm of the night was shared by all who lived within the sound of its tolling. To wake in the deep night and hear the bell of matins was to know that the hour was the hour of prayer, the hour when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinnest, the hour when the soul was most open to visitation. And the sleeper would lie in the darkness, listening to the bell fade, and perhaps they would pray, and perhaps they would simply listen, and then they would turn and seek the second sleep, the bell still echoing in the chambers of the mind as they descended back into the quiet of rest. The morning, when it came, did not arrive all at once. It crept into the room slowly, the light beneath the shutters shifting from black to gray, the gray growing lighter and taking on a color, a pale blue, a soft pink, a muted gold, depending on the weather and the season. The birds would begin their song, a single voice at first, then a chorus, then a cacophony that filled the air and seemed to press against the shutters, demanding entry. The first sleeper to rise would be the one who had slept closest to the door, or the one whose duties required them to be up before the others. They would move carefully, stepping over the sleeping bodies, feeling for the latch of the shutters in the dim light. And when the shutters were opened, The morning light would flood into the room, sudden and complete, revealing the faces of the sleepers, the tangle of blankets, the straw that had escaped from the mattress and lay scattered on the floor. The cold air would rush in, sharp and fresh, carrying the scent of the morning, the damp earth, the distant smoke of another house, the green smell of the fields beyond. And one by one, the sleepers would stir, pulling themselves up from the depths of the second sleep, blinking in the light, reaching for the garments they had folded the night before. The night was over. The cycle was complete. And yet, even as the morning filled the room and the day began, the night remained, folded into the memory of the body, waiting for the sun to set and the darkness to return, waiting for the sleepers to lie down again and begin the long, slow descent into the first sleep, and the waking, and the second, and all the quiet, hidden hours that lay between. The rhythm had not stopped. It had only paused, and it would begin again, as it always did, as soon as the light faded and the shutters were closed and the house settled into the long, patient waiting of the night. The house, when it was inhabited by generations rather than a single family, carried the weight of many nights within its walls. The bed in which a grandfather had slept, in which his children had been conceived, in which his wife had breathed her last, would be the same bed in which the grandchildren now lay, the straw replaced many times, the ropes renewed, the frame darkened by the oils of countless hands that had grasped its posts in the act of rising or of lying down. There was a continuity to the sleeping place that extended beyond the memory of any single sleeper. The hollow in the mattress was not the hollow of one body but the accumulation of many, each adding its slight depression to the shape that had been forming for decades. A child sleeping in that bed would lie in the curve of ancestors, the straw holding the echo of forms that had long since turned to dust, and the child would sleep no differently for knowing it, or for not knowing it. The bed did not remember. It simply held the shape that had been pressed into it, and each new sleeper pressed it a little further, a little deeper, until the day when the straw was emptied out and replaced, and the shape began again. In the hours when the household slept, the objects of daily life rested as well. The loom stood silent in the corner, its warped threads hanging slack, the shuttle resting in the tray. The grinding stone, used to crush grain for the morning bread, sat in its trough, the residue of yesterday's flour still clinging to its surface. The tools of the craftsman, the adze, the plane, the chisel, lay where they had been set down at the end of the day, their wooden handles worn smooth, their metal blades dulled by use. These objects did not have consciousness, but they had presence. They occupied the darkness with the sleepers, their forms familiar, their locations known by heart. To wake in the night and know, without seeing, that the loom was in the corner and the grinding stone by the door, was to know oneself to be in the place where one belonged. The objects were the furniture of the night as much as the bed was, their shapes as fixed in the mind as the constellations were fixed in the sky. And when the morning came and the hands reached for them, they would be exactly where they had been left, waiting, as they had waited through all the nights before. The outdoor world, too, had its sleeping rhythms, though they were different from the rhythms of the house. The fields lay fallow under the darkness, the furrows of the plow invisible in the blackness, the young grain sleeping beneath the soil. The trees stood motionless, their branches bare or heavy with leaves depending on the season, their roots deep in the cold earth. An owl would call from the wood, its voice a low, pulsing sound that traveled across the fields and through the windows of the cottages, reaching the ears of sleepers who registered it without waking. A fox would move along the edge of the forest, its eyes reflecting the starlight, its steps silent on the fallen leaves. These creatures of the night went about their business while the humans slept, their world overlapping with the world of the house but never quite touching it. A sleeper who woke in the interval between sleeps might hear the owl, might hear the fox, and would know that the night was alive beyond the walls, that the darkness held not only stillness but also movement, not only silence but also sound. And then the sleeper would turn, and the movement of the fox would continue, and the owl would call again, and the two worlds, the world of the sleeping house and the world of the waking forest, would exist side by side, separate but not separate, until the first light of dawn brought them together again. There were nights when sleep would not come easily, even in that older world where the rhythm of the first and second sleeps was accepted as natural. A mind troubled by a dispute, or by a loss, or by the anticipation of a difficult journey, would turn the same thoughts over and over in the darkness, the body lying still but the mind unable to find the path to rest. On such a night, the sleeper would lie in the bed, listening to the breathing of the others, feeling the warmth of the bodies beside them, and yet feeling utterly alone in their wakefulness. They would rise, perhaps, and go to the hearth, sitting on the stool that had been warmed by the day's fire, now cold beneath them. They would sit in the darkness, their hands folded in their lap, and they would wait. The waking interval, when it came for the others, would be a comfort. The sound of someone else stirring, the low murmur of a voice, the knowledge that they were not the only one awake in the deep hours. And then, when the household settled again for the second sleep, they would return to the bed, and perhaps this time the mind would release its hold, and they would descend into the lighter sleep of the late night, carrying their troubled thoughts down with them into dreams where the thoughts might dissolve, or might take new shapes, or might simply rest as the body rested, until the morning came and the light made them easier to bear. The children, when they woke in the night, did so without the fear that sometimes accompanies waking in the modern world. The darkness was familiar to them, as familiar as the daylight. They had been born into it, had slept in it every night of their lives, had learned its textures and its sounds as they had learned the faces of their parents. A child who woke from a dream would lie still for a moment, listening, and then would reach out to touch the body of the mother or the father, finding the familiar warmth, the familiar shape. They would press themselves against that warmth, and the fear, if there had been any, would recede, and they would close their eyes and wait for the sleep to return. Sometimes they would be held, an arm coming around them in the darkness, a hand finding their hair, a voice murmuring something that was not quite words but was the sound of comfort. And sometimes they would simply lie beside the sleeping body, listening to the breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of the chest in the darkness, and they would drift back into the first sleep or the second, carried by the rhythm of the body beside them, as they had been carried since before they could remember. In the great houses, where the servants slept in the hall or in the chambers adjacent to the kitchens, the hierarchy of the day extended into the night, but it softened. The servant who attended the lady of the house would sleep on a pallet at the foot of the great bed. And in the night, if the lady called, the servant would rise and go to her, bringing water or adjusting the blankets or simply sitting beside the bed until the lady slept again. The servant's sleep was broken, fragmented by these calls, but it was accepted as the nature of her position. She did not resent the waking. It was part of her duty, as much a part of her night as the first sleep and the second. And in the morning she would rise before the lady, would rekindle the fire, would bring warm water for washing, would lay out the garments for the day, and her own night, with its broken sleep, would be forgotten in the business of the morning. The lady, in turn, would not think of the servant's sleep. She would accept the water, the fire, the garments, as she accepted the bed in which she had rested, the roof over her head, the food that would be prepared for her breaking of the fast. The night, for both of them, had served its purpose. It had given rest to the one and to the other, though the rest had been of a different quality, shaped by the different demands of their positions in the world. The sound of a distant church bell marking the hours was a comfort to those who lay awake. It divided the night into manageable segments, each segment a small unit of time that would pass, that was passing, that would lead eventually to the bell of dawn. A sleeper who woke in the deep hours and heard the bell of matins would know that the night was half over, that the first sleep was behind them, that the waking interval was before them, that the second sleep would come. They would count the hours in their mind, or they would simply listen to the bell fade, and they would know where they were in the architecture of the night. The bell was not a call to action for most sleepers. It was a marker, a signpost on the road through the darkness. And when the bell of lauds sounded, just before dawn, the sleepers would stir, knowing that the night was ending, that the morning was near, that the rhythm was about to turn again toward the day. The bell would fade into the first light, and the birds would begin their song, and the sleepers would lie in the warmth of the bed for a few more minutes, listening to the transition from night to day, from darkness to light, from rest to wakefulness, a transition that had happened every morning of their lives and would happen every morning for as long as they lived. There was no sense, in this rhythm, of the night as an adversary to be conquered, or as an emptiness to be filled. The night was simply there, as the day was there, as the seasons were there, as the turning of the earth was there. The body rested because the body required rest, and the night provided the conditions for that rest. The darkness, the quiet, the long hours free from the demands of labor. The sleepers did not fight the night. They entered into it, as they entered into the rhythm of their work, as they entered into the rhythm of the seasons, as they entered into the rhythm of the prayers that marked the hours. There was a trust in this entering, a surrender that was not passive but active, a giving over of the self to the darkness and the quiet and the slow passage of time. And in the morning, when they rose, they did not look back on the night as a period of absence or of lost time. They carried it with them, the rest that had been given, the dreams that had come, the waking interval with its quiet thoughts and its murmured prayers. The night was not the opposite of the day. It was the companion of the day, the other half of the rhythm, the necessary darkness that made the light visible, the necessary rest that made the labor possible. And so the night continued, in that older world, as it continues now, in the room where the listener lies. The same darkness, the same quiet, the same slow descent into the first sleep and the waking and the second. The same need for warmth, for the presence of another, for the familiar sounds of a house settling around the sleeping body. The same dreams, rising from the depths of the mind, carrying messages that may be understood or may not, that may be remembered or may dissolve with the first light. The same rhythm, ancient and patient, that has carried sleepers through 10,000 nights, through 10,000 years, through all the long history of the body's need for rest. There is nothing to do but lie still, and let the darkness hold you, and let the rhythm take you, as it has taken all the sleepers before you, in the cottages and the halls and the chambers, in the fields and the forests and the roadsides, in the long, quiet history of the night. The house settles. The darkness deepens. The first sleep begins, as it always has, as it always will, and the sleeper descends into it, carried by the rhythm, held by the darkness, resting in the ancient, patient architecture of the night. The hours that are neither night nor day, those that exist in the threshold between darkness and light, held a particular quality in the medieval understanding of rest. They were not the deep black of midnight, nor the clear gray of dawn, but something between, a color for which there was no name, a light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In these hours, the sleepers who had risen for the waking interval would sometimes remain by the hearth longer than they intended, watching the quality of the darkness change, feeling the cold begin to lose its sharp edge, sensing the approach of morning before any visible sign had appeared. The body knew this transition as surely as it knew the transition from waking to sleep. There was a loosening, a softening, a gradual release of the night's hold, and the sleepers who had returned to their beds for the second sleep would lie in this changing light, their dreams becoming thinner, more transparent, as if the approaching dawn were seeping into them and pulling them slowly toward the surface of waking. In the chambers where the sick lay, the night was measured not by sleeps but by the intervals between doses of medicine, by the changing of compresses, by the rise and fall of fever. A woman tending her husband through a winter illness would mark the hours by the burning of a candle, by the calls of the night watch, by the position of the stars visible through a gap in the shutters. She would doze in a chair beside the bed, her sleep shallow, her waking frequent, her hand reaching out in the darkness to touch the forehead of the sick man, to feel whether the heat had risen or fallen. Her own sleep was fragmented, broken into pieces too small to be called a first sleep or a second, but the rhythm of the night still held her, even in this broken form. She was part of the night's architecture, as much as the sleeper who lay undisturbed in the next room. And when the fever broke in the gray hour before dawn, she would sit in the silence and feel the relief spread through her body like the warmth of a fire after a long cold, and she would close her eyes, and sleep would come, not as a first sleep or a second, but as a simple, grateful release, lasting until the light of morning woke her to the business of the day. The children who had not yet learned to speak, the infants who lay in cradles beside their mothers' beds, had their own relationship with the night. They did not distinguish between sleeps. They slept when the body required it, woke when the body required food or warmth, and slept again, their rhythm dictated by the small, urgent needs of their new bodies. A mother would wake to the sound of the infant stirring, would lift the child from the cradle without fully waking herself, would nurse in the darkness, her eyes closed, her body still wrapped in the warmth of the bed, and would return the child to the cradle before sinking back into the first sleep or the second, the interval of waking so brief that it left no mark on her consciousness. The infant, for its part, was learning the rhythm of the night, learning to distinguish between the deep darkness of midnight and the lighter darkness of the hours before dawn, learning to trust that the warmth would return, that the hunger would be answered, that the night was not a place of abandonment but a place of holding. And in this learning, the infant was repeating an experience as old as the species itself, the same rhythm of waking and feeding and sleeping that had carried human infants through all the nights of all the years before. The older children, those who had been moved from the cradle to a pallet beside the parents' bed, would sometimes wake in the night and lie listening to the sounds of the household. They would hear the breathing of the parents, the rustle of straw as a sleeper turned, the distant sound of a dog barking in the village. They would listen to these sounds as if they were music, a music composed of the small, ordinary noises that filled the darkness. And they would learn, in these nighttime listenings, the geography of the night, the way that sound traveled through the walls, the way that silence fell in the hours between the bells, the way that the darkness could be known not by sight but by hearing and by touch. They were learning to be sleepers, learning the rhythm that would carry them through all the nights of their lives, the rhythm of descent and emergence, of depth and shallowness, of the long, slow passage from the closing of the shutters to the first gray light of dawn. And they did not know that they were learning. They were simply lying in the darkness, listening, and the rhythm was entering them, becoming part of them, as the rhythm of the seasons enters the body of a tree and becomes its rings. In the monasteries, where the rhythm of the night was marked by the regular interruption of the bells, the young novices struggled with the discipline of the nocturnal offices. They would be wakened from the first sleep by the bell of matins, would rise from their narrow beds, would make their way to the church in the darkness, their feet finding the familiar path, their hands reaching for the stoles and the books. And in the cold of the church, they would stand with the older monks and chant the psalms, their voices blending with the voices of the community, the words worn smooth by generations of repetition. But the young body wanted sleep, wanted the warmth of the bed, wanted the release of the second sleep that would come after the office was completed. And sometimes, in the middle of a psalm, a novice would feel his head begin to nod, would catch himself as his knees buckled, would struggle to keep his eyes open against the weight of the sleep that pressed upon him. The older monks knew this struggle. They had lived through it themselves years before, had learned to stand through the office even when the body cried out for rest, had learned to find in the chant a kind of waking sleep, a state of consciousness that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep but something in between, a state in which the voice continued and the body stood and the mind drifted somewhere in the darkness between the psalms. And in time, the novice would learn this as well. He would learn to move through the night offices without losing himself entirely, to return to the dormitory after matins and fall into the second sleep as into a pool of warm water, to rise again for lauds and for prime, and to carry the rhythm of the interrupted night into the work of the day, the rhythm shaping him as the straw of the mattress shaped itself to the bodies that lay upon it. The night was not the same for all who lived through it. The baker, whose work began in the hours before dawn, would rise from his bed while the rest of the household still slept, would go to the oven that had been heating through the night, would begin the work of shaping the loaves and sliding them into the heat. His sleep was a sleep of the early night, a first sleep that began at sundown and ended in the deep hours, and his waking interval was not a time of quiet contemplation but a time of labor, of flour and water and fire, of the rhythmic kneading of dough, of the scent of bread rising in the darkness. He did not have a second sleep. His second sleep was the sleep of the afternoon, after the morning's work was done, a short, deep rest that came in the warm hours when the sun was high and the village was quiet. His rhythm was different from the rhythm of the farmer or the merchant, but it was no less a rhythm, no less a part of the architecture of the night and the day. The baker's sleep was shaped by the oven, by the demands of the bread, by the need to have loaves ready for the morning market. And when he woke in the deep hours and walked to the bakery, the darkness was his companion, the familiar darkness of 100,000 mornings, and he moved through it with the certainty of one who has made the same journey every day for years, his feet knowing the path, his hands knowing the dough, his body knowing the rhythm of the night that was his alone. And in the room where the listener lies, in the present darkness, the same rhythm continues, though it may be unrecognized. The body still knows the first sleep and the second, still knows the waking interval that comes in the deep hours, still knows the approach of dawn by the lightening of the darkness behind the eyelids. These rhythms are not learned. They are inherited, passed down through generations of sleepers, through all the nights of all the years, through the beds and the pallets and the floors of all the houses that have held sleeping bodies. The room in which you lie may have electric light and central heat, may have walls that hold the warmth and windows that seal against the wind, but the rhythm of the night is the same. The first sleep will come, if it has not already come, and the body will descend into it, carried by the same current that carried the sleepers of 1,000 years ago. And in the deep hours, there may be a waking, a time of quiet consciousness, of thoughts that drift and settle and drift again, of the body turning in the bed, of the mind moving through the landscape of the night without urgency or fear. And then the second sleep will come, the sleep of the late night, the sleep that carries through to the first light of dawn. And in the morning, when the light wakes you, you will rise and go about your day, carrying with you the rest that was given in the night, the rest that is as old as the rhythm of the turning earth, as old as the need for darkness and quiet and the slow, patient passage of time. The night has not changed. It is the same night that held the sleepers of the medieval world, the same darkness, the same quiet, the same rhythm of descent and emergence. And you are a part of it, as they were, as all sleepers are, lying in the darkness, waiting for the first sleep to take you, waiting for the rhythm to carry you through the hours until the morning comes, as it always comes, as it always will, bringing the light and the sound and the work of the new day, and the promise of another night, another darkness, another descent into the ancient, patient architecture of sleep. The silence that falls in the hour before the first sleep is not the same as the silence that follows. It is a silence of anticipation, of the household withdrawing into itself, of voices ceasing one by one, of the last log settling in the hearth and the last ember fading from red to gray. This silence has a texture, a weight that settles over the room like a blanket laid across the shoulders of the sleepers. It is the silence of thresholds crossed, of the door between the day and the night closing slowly, of the mind beginning its slow release of the tasks and the troubles and the conversations that filled the waking hours. To lie in this silence is to feel the day recede, to watch it from a distance, as one might watch a landscape from the window of a room that is growing dark. The sounds of the day, the voices, the tools, the movement of feet across the floor, fade into memory, and the sounds of the night begin to assert themselves. The settling of the timbers, the breath of the sleepers, the small, secret noises that belong only to the darkness. In the cottages where the walls were of wattle and daub, the silence was never complete. The wind, when it blew, would find the gaps in the walls, and the sound of it was a low, continuous murmur, like the sound of a distant river. The thatch above would rustle, a dry, papery sound that was the voice of the roof speaking to itself. And beneath these sounds, there was the silence of the earth itself, the deep, patient silence of the ground on which the house was built, the silence of the roots and the stones and the slow, turning things that lived beneath the surface of the world. A sleeper lying in this silence would feel it pressing on them from all sides, not as a pressure but as a presence, a vast, slow breathing that was the breathing of the night itself. And in this silence, the mind would let go, would release its hold on the shapes and the sounds and the demands of the day, and would drift down into the first sleep, carried by the silence as a leaf is carried by the current of a stream. The body, in the moments before sleep, would arrange itself in the posture that it would hold through the first part of the night. Some sleepers would lie on the right side, some on the left, some with the knees drawn up, some with the legs extended. There was no instruction for this, no teaching. The body knew, as it knew how to breathe, how to position itself for the descent into rest. The hands would find a place, beneath the pillow, against the chest, tucked between the knees. The head would find the hollow that had been pressed into the straw by nights of sleeping. The blankets would be adjusted, pulled up to the chin or the shoulder, tucked beneath the feet. And then the body would be still, and the breathing would slow, and the mind would begin its drift. This drift was not a falling but a floating, a release of the tension that held the self together during the hours of waking, a loosening of the boundaries between the self and the world. The last thought of the day would surface, would hang for a moment in the darkness behind the closed eyes, and would then dissolve, and there would be no more thoughts, only the darkness and the silence and the slow, steady rhythm of the breath. The dreams that came in the first sleep were the dreams of depth. They were not the fragmented, fleeting images of the second sleep, but long, unfolding narratives that seemed to have their own logic, their own time, their own geography. A sleeper might dream of walking through a forest that was also the village street, of speaking with a neighbor who had died years before, of finding a door in a wall that had never been there before. These dreams had a weight, a substance that remained with the sleeper after waking, that could be recalled and examined in the waking interval, that might carry meaning or might simply be the mind's way of processing the days and the years and the accumulated weight of a life. In the monasteries, the dreams of the first sleep were considered the ones most likely to carry messages from God or from the saints, and the monks would sometimes consult with the abbot about a dream that had troubled them, seeking interpretation, seeking the meaning that lay beneath the surface of the images. In the cottages, the dreams were spoken of less often, but they were remembered, carried into the waking interval and turned over in the quiet of the darkness. And sometimes they would shape the day that followed, a warning heeded, a promise remembered, a face from a dream recognized in a stranger met on the road. The waking interval, when it came, was not a disruption of the night but a continuation of it, a shift from one state to another. The sleeper would surface from the depths of the first sleep with the slowness of a swimmer rising from deep water, the darkness of the room familiar, the body still warm beneath the blankets. There was no disorientation in this waking. It was expected, anticipated, as natural as the shift from the light of day to the darkness of evening. The sleeper would lie for a moment, listening, feeling the presence of the others in the room, the warmth of the bodies beside them, the slow rhythm of the breathing that surrounded them. and then they would rise or they would not rise. Some would remain in the bed, content to lie in the darkness and let their thoughts drift, to feel the cool air on their face and the warmth of the blankets around their body, to be neither fully awake nor fully asleep but somewhere in the space between, a space that belonged only to the night. Others would rise, would wrap a blanket around their shoulders, would move to the hearth or the window, would sit in the darkness and watch the stars or the clouds or the slow movement of the wind through the trees. This was the time of the night that belonged to no one and to everyone, the time when the demands of the day were suspended, when the obligations of the household were set aside, when a person could simply be in the darkness with themselves. In the chambers of the great houses, the waking interval was sometimes a time of quiet industry. A servant would rise to add wood to the fire, the flames leaping up and casting long shadows across the walls, the room warming slowly as the logs caught and burned. A lady would ring for her attendant, would receive a cup of warm wine or watered ale, would sit up in the great bed, the curtains drawn back, the pillows arranged behind her, and would read by candlelight, the pages of a book of hours illuminated with gold leaf that caught the flame and glowed in the darkness. A lord would rise and go to the window, would open the shutters and stand in the cold air, looking out over the courtyard or the fields or the forest beyond the walls, reading the weather in the stars, in the wind, in the quality of the darkness. And then, when the interval had passed, they would return to the bed, would close the curtains, would pull the blankets up, and would sink into the second sleep, the sleep that would carry them through to the first light of dawn. The second sleep was a different country from the first. It was shallower, more porous, more easily penetrated by the sounds of the approaching morning. The dreams that came in the second sleep were the dreams of the surface, the dreams of the body more than the mind, the dreams of thirst and of cold and of the pressure of the blankets against the skin. A sleeper in the second sleep might dream of walking through a house that was also a body, of climbing stairs that led nowhere, of searching for a room that could not be found. These dreams were less likely to be remembered in the morning, less likely to carry the weight of meaning, but they were no less a part of the architecture of the night. They were the dreams of the borderland, the space between sleep and waking, the space where the mind began to prepare itself for the return of consciousness. And as the second sleep thinned, as the first light of dawn began to seep through the shutters, these dreams would dissolve, would become transparent, would fade into the gray light of morning like mist rising from a field at sunrise. The morning, when it came, did not come as a sudden event but as a slow accumulation. The first light would appear behind the shutters, a pale, gray light that seemed to have no source, that was simply there, in the room, filling the spaces that had been filled with darkness. The sleepers would stir, would turn in the bed, would pull the blankets up against the cold that was the cold of the hour before dawn. The birds would begin their song, a single voice, then two, then many, a chorus that grew and swelled until it seemed to fill the world. And then the first sleeper would rise, would cross the room, would open the shutters, and the light would flood in, sudden and complete, revealing the faces of the sleepers, the tangle of blankets, the straw on the floor, the hearth where the embers waited to be rekindled. The night was over. The sleepers would sit up, would rub their eyes, would reach for the garments that they had folded the night before. The day was beginning, and the rhythm of the night, that ancient rhythm of first sleep and waking and second sleep, would fold itself into the memory of the body, would wait through the hours of daylight and labor, would return when the sun set and the shutters closed and the darkness gathered again, would carry the sleepers down into the same depths, through the same intervals, toward the same slow, patient dawn, night after night, season after season, year after year, as long as there were nights to hold them and bodies to rest within the darkness. The rhythm continues. It does not end. It simply pauses, waiting for the light to fade and the shutters to close and the sleepers to lie down again, to begin again, to descend again into the architecture of the night that has held all sleepers, in all places, in all the long, quiet history of rest. The beds that stood in the great halls of the nobility were not merely places for sleeping. They were monuments, constructed of oak that had been felled generations before, carved with patterns that told stories of lineage and conquest and the favor of kings. The posts that rose at each corner were thick as a man's arm, and the canopy above was a ceiling unto itself, draped with fabric that had been woven in distant cities, dyed with colors that had traveled across seas. To lie in such a bed was to lie within a history, to be surrounded by the accumulated wealth and power of a family that had held this land for as long as anyone could remember. The curtains, when drawn, enclosed the sleeper in a space that was both private and public, a space that belonged to the body but also to the lineage, to the name that would be carried forward by the children conceived within these folds. And in the deep hours of the night, when the candles had burned down and the servants slept on their pallets by the door, the lord and lady would lie in this bed, the curtains drawn, the darkness complete, and they would be, for a few hours, simply two bodies resting, the weight of their name and their land and their history lifted from them, held at bay by the fabric that enclosed them. The linen that covered the bed was not the soft, bleached white of later centuries. It was the color of flax, of field and fiber, a pale, grayish cream that held the memory of the plant from which it had been made. The sheets were coarse, woven on looms that stood in the same room where the family ate and worked, and they were washed only at long intervals, when the weather allowed and the labor could be spared. The scent of the linen was the scent of the sun that had dried it, of the smoke that filled the room where it was stored, of the bodies that had lain upon it through the nights. To press one's face into the pillow was to breathe this scent, to inhale the accumulated presence of all the nights that had passed in this bed, all the dreams that had been dreamed, all the conversations that had been held in the darkness, all the children who had been conceived and born and had grown and left and returned to sleep again in the same sheets. The linen did not remember, but the scent lingered, a history written not in words but in the slow accumulation of oils and sweat and the faint, sweet smell of sleep. In the smallest houses, where there was no separate chamber for sleeping, the bed was the center of the room, and the room was the center of the world. The fire burned in the hearth, the pot hung from the hook, the tools leaned against the wall, the chest held the clothing and the blankets and the small, precious things that could not be replaced. And in the bed, the family lay, the parents and the children and sometimes the grandparents, all of them together, their bodies arranged in the order that had been established over years of nights. The youngest child lay between the parents, where the warmth was greatest and the protection was closest. The older children lay at the edges, their bodies turned toward the center, their feet reaching for the warmth of the adults. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, the animals would be brought in from the byre, and they would lie by the hearth, their bodies adding their warmth to the room, their breathing a low, steady counterpoint to the breathing of the sleepers. The house was not divided into zones of function. It was a single space, and the bed was its heart, the place where the family gathered at the beginning and the end of each day, the place where the rhythm of the night held them all together. The children who lay in these beds learned the geography of the night as they learned the geography of the village. They learned the sound of their father's breathing, the way it slowed and deepened in the first sleep, the way it became lighter and more irregular in the second. They learned the warmth of their mother's body, the way she would reach out in the darkness to pull a blanket back over a shoulder that had been exposed. They learned the small, particular sounds of each sleeper, the grandfather who snored, the sister who talked in her dreams, the brother who kicked in his sleep and had to be pushed back to his own side of the bed. And they learned, too, the sounds that came from outside the house, the owl in the wood, the fox in the field, the bell of the church marking the hours. These sounds became the furniture of their nights, as familiar as the stool by the hearth or the chest by the door. And when they grew and left the family bed for a pallet of their own, or for the bed of a spouse, they carried this geography with them, the memory of the shared darkness, the collective breathing, the warmth of bodies arranged in the order of the family. They would never again lie in such a bed with such closeness, but the rhythm of the night would hold them still, would carry them through the first sleep and the waking and the second, as it had carried them since the first night they had lain between their parents, listening to the breathing of the household and learning the slow, patient music of the dark. The hour before dawn, in the houses where there was no bell to mark the offices, was a time of waiting. The sleepers would lie in the second sleep, their dreams thinning, their bodies beginning to stir with the first awareness of the approaching light. And then, one by one, they would rise, not to the sound of a bell or a call, but to the simple knowledge that the night was over, that the light had come, that the day was waiting. They would rise slowly, pulling themselves up from the warmth of the bed, reaching for the garments that lay folded at the foot. They would move to the hearth, would rake back the ash, would find the embers that still held their heat, would blow on them gently until a flame caught and grew. And in the light of that flame, they would see each other's faces, the faces that they had known in darkness, the faces that were as familiar as their own. They would speak, perhaps, a word or two, the first words of the day, quiet and slow, as if the silence of the night were still present, still holding them. And then they would begin the work of the day, the fire built up, the pot hung, the bread broken, the door unbarred. The night was over, but it was not forgotten. It was folded into the day, carried forward, a presence that would remain with them through the hours of light, waiting for the sun to set and the darkness to return, waiting for the bed to be made ready again, waiting for the sleepers to lie down and close their eyes and descend once more into the architecture of the night. The rhythm of the night was not a straight line from darkness to light. It was a circle turning on itself, returning to the same point again and again, each night a repetition of the nights that had come before, each night a variation on the same theme. The first sleep was always the first sleep, the deep rest that came after the long day, but it was never exactly the same first sleep. It was shaped by the day that had preceded it, by the labor and the meals and the conversations, by the weather and the season and the phase of the moon. The waking interval was always the waking interval, the quiet time in the deep hours, but it was never exactly the same waking interval. It was shaped by the dreams that had come in the first sleep, by the thoughts that surfaced in the darkness, by the presence or absence of the other sleepers, by the sounds that traveled through the walls from the village or the forest. The second sleep was always the second sleep, the lighter rest that carried through to dawn, but it was never exactly the same second sleep. It was shaped by the length of the waking interval, by the cold that had crept into the room, by the anticipation of the morning, by the knowledge that the light would soon come. Each night was a new night, a new descent into the darkness, a new passage through the same landscape. And the sleepers who moved through these nights did so without expectation, without the need for the night to be the same as the night before, accepting the variations as they accepted the variations in the weather, in the season, in the pattern of their own lives. The night was not a problem to be solved or a condition to be managed. It was simply there, as the day was there, and they entered into it as they entered into the day, with the same trust, the same surrender, the same patient acceptance of the rhythm that held them. In the room where the listener lies, in the present darkness, the same circle turns. The first sleep will come, if it has not already come, and it will be the first sleep of this night, shaped by this day, by the thoughts and the feelings and the small, particular events that have made this day different from all the days that have come before. The waking interval, if it comes, will be the waking interval of this night, shaped by the dreams that surface, by the thoughts that drift through the mind, by the quality of the darkness beyond the window. The second sleep, if it comes, will be the second sleep of this night, shaped by the approach of dawn, by the sounds of the birds beginning their song, by the light that will slowly seep through the curtains. And then the morning will come, and the day will begin, and the circle will turn again, carrying you through the hours of light toward the next night, the next darkness, the next descent. The rhythm is not broken. It has not been broken by the centuries, by the electric light, by the changes in the way the world is built and the way the body is housed. It continues as it has always continued, patient, inexhaustible, waiting for the sleepers to find their way into it, to let themselves be carried by it, to rest within it as all sleepers have rested, in all the nights of all the years, in the long, quiet history of the dark. The fire in the hearth, when it was kept burning through the night, was not a fire of flames but a fire of embers, a deep, pulsing red that breathed with the drafts of the room. To watch it in the waking interval was to watch something that was neither alive nor dead, a presence that had been with the household since the evening and would remain until the morning, when it would be coaxed back into flame. The embers would shift as the night progressed, the logs settling, the ash accumulating, the glow fading and brightening in a rhythm that had no pattern but was constant. A sleeper who sat by the hearth in the deep hours would watch this rhythm, would let their eyes rest on the red glow, would feel the warmth that radiated from the ash, the last warmth of the day that would not be renewed until the morning. And in the watching, the mind would quiet, would let go of the thoughts that had surfaced in the waking, would drift into a state that was not quite sleep but was not wakefulness either, a state of half-consciousness where the embers and the darkness and the slow passage of time were the only things that existed. In the houses where there was no hearth that could hold a fire through the night, the darkness was absolute. No light penetrated the shutters. No glow from the embers gave shape to the room. The sleepers lay in a blackness so complete that the distinction between having one's eyes open and having them closed disappeared. To open the eyes in such darkness was to see nothing, to be confronted with the same void that existed behind the eyelids. And in this void, the other senses became acute. The sound of a sleeper turning in the bed was not a rustle but a cascade. The straw shifting, the blankets moving, the breath catching and releasing. The scent of the room was not a background but a presence. The smoke in the thatch, the wool of the blankets, the bodies of the sleepers, all of them distinct, all of them layered one upon another. The cold was not a sensation but a geography, the warmth of the bed a territory, the cold of the floor a country beyond the edge of the blankets. To lie in this absolute darkness was to inhabit a world that was made of sound and scent and touch alone, a world that was smaller than the world of the day but deeper, more intimate, more present. The children who were born into such darkness learned it as they learned the faces of their parents. They learned that the darkness was not empty but full, full of the breathing of the household, full of the small, familiar sounds of the house settling, full of the presence of the objects that stood in the room, their shapes known by heart even when they could not be seen. They learned that the darkness held no threat, that it was the same darkness that had held their parents and their grandparents before them, the same darkness that would hold their own children when the time came. And they learned, too, that the darkness would end, that the light would come, that the shutters would be opened and the world of sight would return. This knowledge was not taught. It was absorbed, taken in with the breath of the night, as natural as the rhythm of the first sleep and the second. And when they grew and left the family bed, they carried this knowledge with them, the knowledge that the darkness was a place of rest, not of fear, a place where the body could let go and the mind could drift and the self could be held in the warm, breathing presence of the others who lay nearby. The travelers who slept on the roads, in the fields and the forests, knew a different darkness. It was the darkness of the open sky, the darkness that was not contained by walls and shutters but stretched from horizon to horizon, vast and empty and filled with stars. They would find a place to lie, a bank of earth, a hollow beneath a tree, a patch of grass that was dry enough to offer some protection from the damp. They would wrap themselves in their cloaks, would pull the hood over their heads, would lie on the hard ground and look up at the stars. And in the darkness of the open sky, they would watch the constellations turn, would mark the passage of the hours by the movement of the stars across the heavens. The first sleep would come, But it would not be the deep, warm sleep of a bed in a house. It would be a shallow, watchful sleep, the sleep of one who is not safe, who must remain aware of the sounds of the night, of the possibility of other travelers, of the animals that moved in the darkness beyond the circle of the camp. And yet, even this sleep had its rhythm, its first sleep and its waking and its second, the same rhythm that held the sleepers in the houses and the halls, the same rhythm that held all sleepers wherever they lay, under roofs or under stars. The waking interval for the traveler was not a time of quiet contemplation in the warmth of a bed. It was a time of alertness, of listening to the sounds of the night, of watching the stars, of feeling the cold that had seeped through the cloak and the ground beneath. The traveler would rise, perhaps, would gather wood for a fire, would strike a flint and coax a flame from the tinder, would sit by the small, flickering light and warm his hands and watch the darkness beyond the circle of the fire. He would think of the road behind him, of the road ahead, of the inn where he would sleep the next night, of the bed that would hold him and the roof that would cover him. And then, when the fire had burned down to embers, he would lie down again, would wrap himself again in his cloak, would close his eyes and wait for the second sleep to come. And it would come, the lighter sleep of the late night, the sleep that carried through to the first light of dawn. And when the dawn came, he would rise, would kick dirt over the embers, would shoulder his pack, and would continue on his way, the rhythm of the night folded into the rhythm of the road, the two rhythms moving together, carrying him forward through the days and the nights of his journey. The pilgrims who walked the long roads to the shrines of the saints knew the night as a companion. They would walk through the daylight hours, their feet finding the path that had been worn by the feet of those who had come before, their voices rising in the hymns that had been sung for generations. And when the sun set, they would find a place to rest, a hospice if there was one, a barn if there was none, the open ground if there was no shelter to be had. They would lie down together, the pilgrims, their bodies close for warmth, their cloaks spread over them, their voices quiet in the darkness. And in the night they would wake as all sleepers wake, in the interval between the first sleep and the second. They would lie in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the others, feeling the ground beneath them, the cold air on their faces. And they would pray, the prayers that they had come on this journey to offer, the prayers for healing, for forgiveness, for the souls of the dead, for the safe return to the homes they had left behind. And then they would sleep again, the second sleep of the pilgrim, the sleep that would carry them through to the dawn and the road and the next stage of the journey. And when they reached the shrine, when they knelt before the relics of the saint, they would remember the nights, the long nights on the road, the darkness and the cold and the prayers offered in the interval between sleeps. Those nights were part of the pilgrimage as much as the days, as much as the shrine itself. They were the nights that had held them, had carried them, had brought them, at last, to the place where they had been seeking to go. In the room where the listener lies, the darkness is not the darkness of the road or the forest. It is the darkness of a room that is known, a room that has been prepared for rest, with walls and windows and a bed that is familiar. The rhythm of the night is the same, though. The first sleep, when it comes, will be the deep rest of the body that has completed the day's work, whatever that work may have been. The waking interval, if it comes, will be the quiet time in the deep hours, the time for thoughts that drift and settle, for the body to turn in the bed, for the mind to be still. The second sleep will be the lighter rest that carries through to the first light of dawn. And when the morning comes, the light will seep through the curtains, and the birds will begin their song, and the day will begin, as it has begun for all the sleepers in all the nights of all the years. The rhythm continues. It does not end. It simply turns as the earth turns, carrying the sleepers through the darkness toward the light toward the darkness again, in the long, slow, patient turning that has held all sleepers, in all places, in all the nights that have been and all the nights that will be. There is nothing to do but lie still, and let the rhythm take you, and rest, as all sleepers rest, in the ancient, patient architecture of the night.